Welcome back to my channel, where we uncover the forgotten corners of the past. Today, I'm taking you into a story about a seemingly innocent photograph from 1847 that, when magnified, uncovered a brutal crime and a love story erased by power that you might have never heard before. A mystery buried in the dust of time, a truth that will send shivers down your spine. But before we embark on this journey, take a moment to let me know where are you listening to this story from. That helps me understand how far these secrets have traveled. And if this story truly captivates you, if it makes you ponder, don't hesitate to give me a like and subscribe to the channel to keep me going. Together, we'll explore the darkest pages of history, and you won't want to miss a thing. In the quiet halls of the Metropolitan Museum of Art, where the air itself seems thick with the weight of centuries, secrets lie dormant behind protective glass. They are not waiting for the fleeting admiration of the crowds, but for a gaze sharp enough, a soul patient enough to hear their silent screams across the gulf of time. On a gloomy Tuesday in November, as a soft, persistent rain tapped a mournful rhythm against the tall, arched windows, one of those secrets, buried for over 170 years, began to stir. Dr. Carmen Rodriguez, a leading expert in historical photography, was completing the final, painstaking entries for the massive Harrison Williams donation. At 42, Carmen had built her life around the study of the 19th century's haunting images. She understood their language, the language of stillness, of long exposures that captured not just a likeness, but the very soul of a moment. The thrill of potential discovery had never dulled within her. It was a low, constant hum beneath the surface of her academic discipline. For 3 relentless weeks, she had meticulously catalogued each artifact, her gloved hands treating each piece with the reverence of a priestess handling sacred relics. Now, only one last box remained. "Just one more," she murmured, the words a small cloud in the cool, dry air of the archive room. Her hands gently, almost hesitantly, opened a small navy blue velvet case that felt unnaturally cold to the touch. Inside, a daguerreotype lay in a state of astonishing, impossible perfection. The silver-plated copper glowed with a warm, ghostly light beneath her filtered workstation lamp, still hermetically sealed behind its original glass. A shiver, sharp and electric, ran down Carmen's spine. Daguerreotypes from 1847 were rare treasures in America. One in such immaculate condition was a miracle. The portrait depicted a man of about 30 with a carefully tended mustache and eyes that held a storm of unspoken thoughts. Beside him, a woman with dark hair swept into a precise, neat bun, her posture a study in quiet defiance. Both wore the sober, formal attire of their time. Yet their faces filled Carmen with a profound, an indescribable unease. It was an instinct she had learned to trust above all else. Unlike the stiff, rigid solemnity of typical Victorian portraits, a mask of propriety necessitated by the long exposure times, this couple's expression revealed a raw, quiet intimacy, a gentle, shared sorrow. They weren't looking at the camera, at the future, at posterity. They seemed to be gazing into a world of their own, a fragile sanctuary the lens had only accidentally breached. Carmen leaned closer, her breath fogging a small patch on the glass. Their eyes, she realized, did not hold the pride of people wishing to preserve their legacy, but the harrowing fragility of those about to lose everything. Their shared gaze was a pact, a confession, a shared secret of a tragedy sealed forever in that thin, luminous layer of silver. Her professional mind raced, but her gut whispered a different story. This was no ordinary family memento. She carefully turned the case over, her heart hammering against her ribs. A faded, handwritten paper label was affixed to the back. New York, 1847, J.M. and M.C. The ink, brown with age, seemed to tremble across the card, as if penned by a hand shaking with fear, or perhaps with the finality of grief. These initials felt less like a signature and more like a forgotten epitaph, a final, desperate plea for remembrance before being swallowed whole by history. To understand the tremor in that ink, one must step out of the museum's sterile silence and into the brutal, beautiful world that created this photograph, the New York City of the 1840s. It was not the steel and glass metropolis of today. It was a city of violent contrasts, built on a foundation of unforgiving social architecture, where the invisible walls of class and lineage were stronger and more absolute than any stone building. On the surface, it was a city of exhilarating progress, of horse-drawn carriages clattering over cobblestones, of gaslit ballrooms where silk gowns rustled with the sound of new money. But beneath that glittering, paper-thin veneer lay a rigid caste system, ruled with an iron fist by a handful of old, powerful aristocratic families, many of Spanish origin. They were dynasties who brought the power, the pride, and the prejudices of the old world to the new. For these families, honor was not an abstract concept, it was a fortress, and its walls were built with the stones of obedience and tradition. Lineage was everything. The preservation of purity of blood was a dogma more sacred than religion, an obsession that outweighed personal happiness, that dwarfed love, and that could, in the end, extinguish life itself. In their gilded world, marriage was a strategic transaction, an alliance between houses, not a union of hearts. Love, especially a love that dared to cross the unbridgeable chasm of class, was not merely forbidden, it was seen as a contagion, a disease that could contaminate an entire bloodline. It was an act of treason that had to be surgically, ruthlessly eradicated. Anyone who dared to challenge this unwritten law would face not just social ostracism, they would face complete and total erasure, cut from the family history with such precision that it would be as if they had never existed at all. It was this unforgiving world that Dr. Carmen Rodriguez was now determined to penetrate, armed with only a silver plate and two trembling initials. She knew the answers would not be found in the official history books, the sanitized chronicles written by the victors. The answers, if they existed, were hidden in the margins, in the silences, in the smallest of details, the cracks in the perfect facade of the past. The next morning, she arrived at the museum's digital restoration laboratory before the sun had fully risen over the city. Miguel Santos, one of the country's finest art digitization technicians, was already there, the quiet hum of his equipment the only sound in the room. "Good morning, Carmen," he said, his eyes lighting up with professional curiosity. "Don't tell me. You have that look. What have we got that's special today?" "A daguerreotype from 1847, she replied, her voice low with a reverence that silenced the room as she placed the case on the scanner with the utmost care. "It came in with the Harrison Williams donation, but it's different. The clarity is impossible, and their expressions." Miguel picked up a magnifying glass, his usual cheerful demeanor replaced by intense focus. He studied the plate in silence for a long moment. He slowly nodded, whistling under his breath. "You're right," he conceded. "The detail is extraordinary. Whoever made this was a master, or maybe a magician. Let's scan it at 4000 dpi. If there's a ghost in this machine, we'll find it." For the next 40 minutes, a palpable tension filled the lab as the machine meticulously traced every shadow, every gleam on the ancient silver surface. Carmen stood transfixed, her hands clenched. She was familiar with this ritual, but today it felt different. It felt sacred. She had a certainty stirring deep within her, an almost obsessive conviction that something monumental waited beneath that placid surface. She wasn't just a historian doing a job. She felt like a medium, an unwilling keeper of memories, entrusted with the solemn duty to speak for those who had been violently forced into silence. "Ready?" Miguel finally announced, his voice cutting through the tension. "Now, let's see what secrets it holds." The digitized image materialized on the 32-inch monitor, glowing with an ethereal light. Carmen leaned forward, her eyes scanning every pixel. As details the naked eye could never have caught began to resolve out of the digital ether. The delicate, lace-like patterns embroidered on the woman's gown, the faint reflection of a window in the man's left eye. And then, something else. On the man's chest was a brooch, and its surface was etched with a heraldic design of astonishing, impossible complexity. It was a level of microscopic detail that was surreal, a physical impossibility for the photographic technology of the 1840s. It wasn't an artifact of the image. It was an inscription. It was like an encrypted message, a sign deliberately hidden in plain sight, waiting for the right eyes to find it. Carmen's heart began to beat a frantic, suffocating rhythm. This was it. The crack in the facade had just splintered wide open. "Miguel," she said, her voice barely a whisper, hoarse with anticipation. "Enlarge the brooch." The command hung in the air, sharp and absolute. Miguel's fingers flew across the keyboard, and the image on the screen swelled, zooming past the fabric of the man's coat, past the frame of the brooch itself, until the heraldic shield at its center dominated the monitor. What appeared before them drew the breath from their throats. It was not a mere approximation or an artist's rendering. It was a perfect, microscopically detailed engraving. A rampant lion on a field of gold, crowned by a ducal coronet, beneath which unfurled a Latin motto, Veritas et Honor, truth and honor. A cold dread, mingled with a terrifying sense of purpose, washed over Carmen. She recognized it instantly, not from a casual textbook, but from the deep, specialized archives of her doctoral research. "It can't be," she whispered, leaning so close to the screen that her reflection stared back at her from within the ancient image. Proximity, she hoped, might somehow deny the truth, but the shield was unmistakable. It was a sigil of immense power, a name that echoed with the weight of empire and the rustle of secrets. "I need to make some urgent consultations." For the next 3 hours, Carmen lost herself in the museum's specialized library, a silent cathedral of forgotten knowledge, surrounded by towering shelves of ancient tomes, the air thick with the scent of decaying paper and leather. She worked with a mounting, feverish urgency. The yellowed pages of armorials and genealogical records creaked like brittle bones beneath her gloved fingers. She was no longer just a historian. She was an archaeologist, digging not through earth, but through layers of carefully constructed lies. Then, at last, her voice rang out in the silence, a cry of triumph and horror. "Here it is." She pointed to an illustration in an 1834 armorial of New York's noble families. The crest belonged to the Mendoza Carvajal family, one of the oldest and most formidable houses to cross from Spain into the New World. Her pulse hammered in her temples as she read. For centuries, The Mendoza Carvajals had been advisors to Spanish royalty, their name woven into the very fabric of Europe's power. And in 1847, the very year etched into the daguerreotype, the heir to the family's vast fortune in New York was Don Joaquin Mendoza Carvajal, 31 years old. JM? Carmen murmured, the initials on the box now burning in her mind. Joaquin Mendoza, the man in the portrait, the man with the storm in his eyes, was no ordinary citizen. He was the scion of a dynasty. But who, then, was MC? She pressed deeper into the records, moving from the proud, public histories to the drier, more factual municipal archives. It was there she found the official story, a narrative so clean it felt sterile. Official documents stated that Don Joaquin Mendoza Carvajal had died unmarried in 1851, leaving no heirs. The cause of death was listed as tuberculosis, a common enough tragedy for the era, but as she cross-referenced other, quieter sources, society journals, private letters, faint whispers of a scandal emerged, a forbidden romance, a name carefully, surgically excised from the family's history. The official record wasn't just incomplete, it was a fabrication, a wall built to hide something. Carmen knew she had reached the limits of public knowledge. She needed someone who trafficked in the stories that were never written down. She reached for the telephone and dialed the number of the one man who might hold the key. Professor Eduardo Ramirez, 73 years old, was the foremost authority on 19th century American aristocracy and, more importantly, the custodian of secrets that had never reached publication. Professor, Carmen said, her voice urgent, I need your help with something delicate. I believe I've found a daguerreotype of Don Joaquin Mendoza Carvajal, taken in 1847, but he appears with a woman I cannot identify. The line went silent. The pause stretched, heavy and deliberate, each second thick with unspoken meaning. At last, Ramirez answered, his voice laced with a careful, guarded restraint. Carmen, can you come to my office immediately? There are parts of the Mendoza Carvajal story that have never been spoken of. His office awaited her at the top of a weathered brownstone in Greenwich Village. Carmen climbed the worn marble stairs, her anticipation mounting with each echoing footfall. The place itself seemed to guard its secrets, much like the photograph now hidden in her portfolio. Professor Ramirez greeted her at the door, an elegant figure with hair as white as snow and eyes as sharp as steel. The room unfolded like a labyrinth, its shelves brimming with manuscripts and leather-bound books, portraits of long-dead families whose painted eyes followed her every step. It was not an office. It was a mausoleum of whispered truths. Professor, she began, settling into a cracked leather chair opposite his desk. Before I show you the photograph, tell me, what do you know of Don Joaquin Mendoza Carvajal's private life? Ramirez poured himself tea, the silence deliberate, a calculated act of theater. He was weighing her, judging if she was worthy of the truth. At last, he spoke, his voice low and grave. What I am about to tell you, Carmen, has never been published. It is a story the Mendoza Carvajals spent a fortune to bury. Don Joaquin loved a woman far outside the aristocracy. She was, by all accounts, strikingly beautiful, intelligent, and possessed a spirit that captivated him completely. But her humble birth made the match intolerable to his family. Do you know her name? Carmen pressed, feeling the truth drawing near, a physical presence in the room. Maria Carmen Delgado Eva, Ramirez replied, rising to search among his private files. the daughter of a modest textile merchant, educated far beyond her station. She worked as a governess for one of the city's wealthy families. A chill ran through Carmine, cold and sharp. "M.C.," she whispered. "The initials on the box." "Exactly." Ramirez nodded, pulling a thin folder from a locked drawer. "Now, show me this photograph." His voice held a mix of solemnity and a scholar's barely concealed eagerness. With careful precision, Carmen produced the high-resolution print of the daguerreotype and laid it before him. Ramirez adjusted his glasses and studied the image in silence. At length, he murmured, his voice filled with awe. "Extraordinary. This may be the only visual proof of their bond. Carmen, do you realize what you hold? This was likely taken in secret, a symbolic union, a marriage of sorts, captured in silver." "What became of Maria Carmen?" she asked, though a sense of dread was already gripping her heart. Ramirez removed his glasses and fixed her with a direct, sorrowful gaze. "She vanished in 1848, gone without a trace. Don Joaquin withered soon after. Officially, he died of tuberculosis 3 years later, but those who knew him believed it was grief that carried him to the grave. His family told him and the world that she had simply left him and returned to Europe. The next morning, armed with a name and a terrible suspicion, Carmen accompanied Ramirez to the New York City archives. There, they were greeted by Isabel Moreno, a 50-year-old archivist whose reputation for precision and integrity was unmatched. "Professor Ramirez, always an honor," Isabel said warmly. "Your message yesterday intrigued me. It is not often we are asked to trace those who disappeared in the last century." Carmen laid out the discovery of the daguerreotype and its possible link to Maria Carmen Delgado Eva. Isabel listened intently, her pen scratching across a notebook as the weight of long-buried secrets began to stir once more in the quiet, dust-filled room. "Maria Carmen Delgado Eva," Isabel repeated softly as she began her search in the digitized archive system. "Let's see what we can uncover." For 2 hours, Isabel combed through parish registers, municipal logs, and brittle manuscripts. Then, finally, she paused, her eyes fixed on a faded page. "This is remarkable," she said, pointing to a handwritten entry dated March 1848. "From St. Paul's Chapel. Maria Carmen requested travel documents for France." Carmen and Professor Ramirez exchanged a sharp glance. "France? But why?" Carmen asked. "According to this record," Isabel continued, "she declared she had family in Paris and needed to travel urgently. Yet here, see this marginal note." She pointed to a small spidery script in the corner. It read, "Verify with higher authorities." "That's highly unusual." Isabel reached for another file, her voice dropping. "But there is something far more disturbing. A police report from April 1848 states that Maria Carmen was last seen at an inn near the Canadian border." "She never crossed over," Isabel confirmed, her face grim. "Her belongings were found abandoned, including a letter that was never sent." Professor Ramirez leaned forward urgently. "What did the letter say?" Isabel adjusted her spectacles and read from the transcribed report, her voice steady but filled with the gravity of the words. It was addressed to someone called J.M. The letter says, "My love, if you are reading this, it means I could not reach our meeting place. You know our love is stronger than your family's threats. I will wait for you in Paris until you can join me. always yours. MMC. Carmen's breath caught in her throat. Joaquin and Maria Carmen had planned to flee together, but someone had stopped her. The full, monstrous scope of the conspiracy hit her with the force of a physical blow. The Mendoza Carvajal family had not only lied to Joaquin, telling him that Maria Carmen had abandoned him for France. They had publicly reported that she had arrived there safely, a deliberate act of misdirection, while the police records told a much, much darker tale. The family hadn't just disapproved of the match. They had orchestrated a disappearance. The paper trail had gone cold, ending in the bureaucratic whisper of a life abandoned at the border, a ghost in the archives. But Carmen knew, with the certainty of a scholar who has spent a lifetime listening to the dead, that history is not lived in documents alone. It is lived in the flesh, its triumphs and its traumas encoded not in ink, but in blood and memory. The police report was a dead end, but it was also a signpost. It provided a timeline, a crucial, terrible window into the last desperate days of Maria Carmen Delgado Eva. If the Mendoza Carvajal family had abducted her, if they had committed an act of such audacious cruelty, they would have needed help. They would have needed servants, people sworn to silence, whose eyes saw things they were never meant to see, whose ears heard whispers they were never meant to repeat, people whose forbidden knowledge might curdle over time into family legends. Stories passed down through generations like a dark, unshakable inheritance. The investigation pivoted. Days bled into weeks of relentless, painstaking genealogical research. Carmen and a small dedicated team began tracing the lineages of every person who had served in the Mendoza Carvajal household during the late 1840s. It was a process akin to chasing phantoms, a search for a single, living voice in a vast, silent graveyard of time. They sifted through census records, church registries, and employment logs, following faint trails that often led to nothing. It was frustrating, soul-wearying work. But Carmen was driven by a force she could no longer entirely explain. It was more than academic curiosity. It was a mission. She felt the weight of Maria Carmen's stolen future, the chilling injustice of her erasure. She would not let her remain a footnote in someone else's cruel story. And then, at last, a breakthrough. A name surfaced in a baptismal record from 1901, Pilar Ruiz Morales, born to a mother whose maiden name was Esperanza. The dates aligned. The location was right. With a surge of adrenaline, Carmen traced the lineage forward. She found her, alive, 85 years old, the great-granddaughter of the Mendoza Carvajal's cook. Carmen found her living at Sunset Manor, a quiet, sterile nursing home on the Upper West Side, a place where the past was often more present and more vivid than the future. Mrs. Ruiz, Carmen began gently, her voice soft so as not to startle the elderly woman. They sat in a sunlit, antiseptic room, the scent of lavender and disinfectant hanging in the air. We are historical researchers. We are investigating the Mendoza Carvajal family of the 19th century. Pilar's eyes, clouded with the mists of age, suddenly sharpened with a shocking, lucid clarity, a flicker of something fear, recognition. A deep and ancient sorrow passed across her face. Ah, the Mendoza Carvajals, she said, her voice a fragile, quivering thing, like the rustle of dry leaves. My great-grandmother, Esperanza. She served them for many, many years. She always said they did terrible things, things that stained the soul, she would say, but she only spoke of it when death was near, as if to unburden herself before meeting her Maker. It was our family's secret, our ghost. Professor Ramirez, who had accompanied Carmen, leaned forward, his own voice a gentle murmur. Careful not to break the fragile thread of memory. What exactly did she tell you? Mrs. Ruiz, it is of the utmost importance. Pilar hesitated. A long, heavy silence stretched between them, filled only by the ticking of a nearby clock, each second marking the passage of a history that refused to stay buried. She was weighing a lifetime of silence, the loyalty to her ancestors, against the urgent plea in the eyes of these strangers. At last, she whispered, the words tumbling out as if a dam of memory had finally, irrevocably broken. In the spring of 1848, April, I think she said, 3 men brought a young woman to the house in the dead of night. She was unconscious, but alive. My great-grandmother, Esperanza, was in the kitchen. She saw them carry her through the servants' entrance, like a sack of flour. Carmen felt her pulse quicken. A cold, sharp drumbeat in the quiet, sunlit room. What happened to her? Esperanza saw what saw her, Pilar continued, her eyes looking far away, into a past she had only seen through another's horrified memory. A striking young woman, she said, dark hair, wearing fine traveling clothes, though they were torn and muddied, and around her neck a small silver medallion, marked with the initials MC. They locked her in a storage room in the basement. For 3 days, Esperanza was the one ordered to carry food and water down to her. The woman lived, but she was fevered and wept constantly, refusing to eat. She would call out a name over and over again, a desperate, broken sound. Joaquin. Pilar's own eyes filled with tears, a grief inherited across a century. On the 4th day, her voice dropped even lower, becoming a conspiratorial, terrified whisper. The room was empty. The tray of food from the night before was untouched. Professor Ramirez's voice was grave, heavy as a tombstone. What became of Maria Carmen? My great-grandmother never knew for certain, Pilar confessed, her frail hands trembling in her lap. But that night, she saw the same men loading something heavy, something long, wrapped in thick canvas, into a carriage. She was hiding in the shadows of the scullery, her heart in her throat, and she overheard them whisper. They were impatient, angry. They spoke of the old Woodlawn Cemetery. One of them said that no one would ever find her there, buried among the paupers and the forgotten. The weight of the revelation settled in the room, chilling the warm sunlight. This was no longer a historical inquiry. This was the testimony of a witness, a voice reaching across more than a century and a half to report a kidnapping, an imprisonment, and a murder. Carmen understood with chilling certainty. They had not just uncovered a scandal, they had found the scene of a crime. After obtaining Pilar's sworn, videotaped testimony, a legacy of truth finally passed from the shadows into the light. Carmen knew her next call. She contacted Dr. Laura Mendez, a renowned forensic archaeologist at Columbia University, a woman who specialized in giving names back to the nameless dead. Carmen, what you've told me it's beyond extraordinary, Laura said when they met in her laboratory, a space surrounded by the silent, patient bones of the long dead. If we find physical proof of this, if we can corroborate this powerful testimony, this could fundamentally alter the way 19th century American social history is written. It would be the first documented case of its kind, a glimpse into the true, terrifying power these families wielded. For 2 relentless weeks, Carmen navigated the labyrinth of city bureaucracy, pursuing the necessary permits from the city and the Department of Historical Heritage. It was a fight. The Mendoza Carvajal name, though ancient, still carried weight, but the combination of the daguerreotype, the official records of disappearance, and Pilar's sworn, videotape testimony was enough. The permit was granted. On a biting December morning, as the city braced for the first heavy snow of winter, Carmen, Laura, and a team of archaeologists entered the overgrown, forgotten quarter of Woodlawn Cemetery. It was a place where time had stood still, where many 19th century graves lay hidden beneath a century of neglect, their markers toppled and swallowed by the earth. According to Esperanza's account, Maria Carmen would have been buried in a secluded section, likely without a marker. Laura explained, her breath misting in the frigid air as she unrolled the site plans. A place no one would think to look. A place designed to be forgotten. Ground-penetrating radar began its slow, methodical sweep across the frozen, unforgiving soil. Its electronic signals probed deep into the earth, searching for anomalies, for the telltale disturbances that might betray a forgotten, violent burial. For 3 long days, they searched with relentless precision, the biting cold seeping into their bones. The initial hope that had fueled them began to wane, replaced by a grim, silent determination. They found other unmarked graves, but none that matched timeline. The earth was holding its secrets tight. Then, on the 4th morning, as a pale, watery sun did little to warm the air, Laura's voice cut through the cold, a sharp, sudden cry of discovery. "Carmen," she said, her eyes locked on the readings on her screen, her voice tight with controlled excitement. "We found something." There it was, evidence of a burial completely absent from the cemetery's official, meticulous records. The disturbed soil deep beneath the surface revealed the clear signs of haste. A grave dug quickly, brutally, and without the customary care of the time. With painstaking, almost reverential precision, the team began the excavation. Carmen watched, her heart torn between the professional thrill of discovery and the profound, gut-wrenching human sorrow of what they were about to find. Hours passed, measured in the careful scraping of trowels and the gentle sifting of earth, until Laura's sudden, sharp cry shattered the winter silence. "Carmen, come quickly. Oh my God, this is extraordinary." At the bottom of the pit, nestled in the dark, cold earth that had held her for 170 years, lay a human skeleton, remarkably preserved by the unique composition of the soil. But it was the object beside the bones, resting near the delicate cervical vertebrae, that froze Carmen in place, stealing the very air from her lungs. A small silver medallion, blackened and tarnished with age. After careful, delicate cleaning back in the climate-controlled environment of the lab, the engraving revealed itself, clear and undeniable, as if it had been etched only yesterday. The initials M.C. inscribed in a graceful, elegant 19th century script. Forensic tests confirmed Carmen's deepest dread and her most fervent hope for justice. Dr. Laura Mendez's final report was a document of clinical precision and utterly devastating humanity. She identified clear, undeniable signs of cranial trauma on the right parietal bone of the skull, the unmistakable mark of a severe blow from a heavy, blunt weapon. Carbon-14 analysis dated the remains to between 1848 and 1850, a perfect match for the time of Maria Carmen Delgado Eva's disappearance. The earth, at last, had confessed its oldest, darkest secret. Carmen knew it was time. The truth, exhumed from the cold ground, had to be brought into the light. She arranged a press conference at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, bringing the story full circle to the very place where it had first whispered to her from a velvet box. Rumors of the extraordinary discovery had already seeped into academic and archaeological circles, and reporters from around the world crowded the august hall, a sense of momentous, world-changing history crackling in the air. Standing at a podium before the assembled press, the original daguerreotype of Joaquin and Maria Carmen projected on a vast screen behind her. Carmen took a deep breath and steadied her voice. "What began as the routine cataloging of a generous donation," she announced, her voice clear and strong, resonating through the hushed room, "has become the revelation of one of the 19th century America's most tragic and criminal love stories." One by one, with the methodical precision of a scholar and the moral force of an advocate, she presented the chain of evidence. She laid out the case like a prosecutor addressing a jury of the entire world. The original daguerreotype, with its hidden message, the historical documents that hinted at a cover-up, the sworn, emotional testimony of Pilar Ruiz Morales, a voice from the past, and finally, the stark, irrefutable forensic photographs of the remains of the silver medallion unearthed at Woodlawn Cemetery. "The proof is conclusive," she declared, her gaze sweeping across the stunned, silent faces in the room. Maria Carmen Delgado Ava was abducted by order of the Mendoza Carvajal family when she tried to flee with Don Joaquin to France. She was imprisoned in their home and, we must conclude from the forensic evidence, was later murdered to bury the scandal of her love for their son. Professor Ramirez stepped forward to provide the devastating historical context. "This case demonstrates, in the most brutal and tangible terms, how 19th century aristocratic families wielded a power that was absolute. They operated above the law, acting as judge, jury, and executioner, not only over matters of wealth and lineage, but over the very lives of those they deemed beneath them." A reporter from the New York Times raised a question, his voice cutting through the stunned silence. "Dr. Rodriguez, what became of Don Joaquin after Maria Carmen vanished? Did he know?" "Our research shows unequivocally that he never knew the truth," Carmen answered, her voice softening with a profound sorrow for the man in the photograph. "His family constructed an elaborate lie. They led him to believe she had reached France and had chosen to begin a new life without him, perhaps with another man. He spent the remainder of his short, tragic years waiting for news, for a letter that would never come. He died in 1851, officially of tuberculosis, but in reality, of a broken heart, never knowing that the woman he loved had been killed by his own blood." The revelations from the press conference sparked a global firestorm of public fury and intense academic debate. The story was on the front page of every major newspaper. Lawyers representing the modern-day Mendoza Carvajal descendants, now a powerful and respected international corporation, immediately tried to silence her. They issued vehement denials, threatening multi-million-dollar lawsuits for defamation, attempting to cast doubt on the evidence and discredit Carmen personally. They offered a substantial 8-figure donation to the museum in exchange for her silence and the retraction of her findings. But Carmen, now the custodian of Maria Carmen's memory, held her ground. In a public statement that echoed around the world, she gave her simple, powerful reply: "Maria Carmen's memory is not for sale." The power that had so easily silenced a young woman in 1848 had finally, after 170 years, met a will it could not break. The family's threats and their offers of hush money were met with a tsunami of public indignation. In the global court of public opinion, the verdict was instantaneous and merciless. The Mendoza Carvajal name, once a symbol of aristocratic prestige and unassailable old-world power, became instantly and irrevocably synonymous with corruption, cruelty, and a crime so cold-blooded it defied modern comprehension. The carefully constructed facade of philanthropy and corporate responsibility, a gleaming edifice built over generations, crumbled to dust in a matter of weeks. Headlines screamed from every newsstand and digital screen. Protesters gathered outside their corporate headquarters in New York, London, and Madrid, holding enlarged images of the daguerreotype. Their silent faces a powerful accusation. Stocks in their global corporation plummeted in a catastrophic spiral. Long-standing business partners, families who had allied with them for a century, quietly and publicly severed ties, issuing statements condemning the historical atrocities that had come to light. The family, once titans of industry and society, found themselves social pariahs. Their name, a permanent, indelible stain on the historical record they had tried so desperately and so violently to control. The collapse was not just financial, it was existential. The very foundation of their identity, their honor, their legacy was revealed to be built upon the bones of a murdered girl. In the face of this overwhelming public pressure and the unassailable scientific evidence, the city of New York took an unprecedented step. 6 months after the press conference, after contentious city council meetings and passionate public debate, they officially authorized the creation of a monument to honor Maria Carmen's life. It was to be erected in a restored, peaceful section of Woodlawn Cemetery, a quiet garden not far from where her unmarked grave had been discovered. The act itself was a profound redefinition of history. Maria Carmen Delgado. Ava was no longer a footnote, no longer a whispered scandal or a forgotten victim. She was being officially written back into the narrative of the city, not as a mistress, but as a martyr, a symbol of a love that defied the brutal conventions of her time, and of a truth that had outlasted the power that sought to silence it. Carmen herself was asked to write the inscription. She spent weeks contemplating the weight of the task, the need to distill a life of stolen promise and a legacy of profound injustice into a few perfect words. She watched as the simple, elegant stone monument of white marble was raised, the final, tangible act in a mission of justice that had consumed her. It read, Maria Carmen Delgado Eva. Her love was stronger than the conventions of her time, and her memory endures beyond the power that sought to silence her. The daguerreotype, the silent catalyst for this entire historical reckoning, now occupied a place of singular honor in the Metropolitan Museum's permanent collection, encased in a climate-controlled display. It was no longer just a portrait. It was an artifact of a crime, a testament to a love story, and a symbol of historical justice. Visitors poured in, drawn by the global story to the image of the couple with the sad, knowing eyes. They stood before it in hushed silence, not just looking at a photograph, but bearing witness to a story that had finally, after so long, been told. The image had transcended its frame, becoming a universal emblem of love-defying class and of the courage it takes to pursue truth, no matter how deep it is buried. At the monument's unveiling ceremony, a small, solemn affair under a gray autumn sky, Professor Ramirez stood beside Carmen, looking at the newly carved stone. "You've done something extraordinary, Carmen," he told her, his voice thick with an emotion that transcended academic appreciation. "You haven't merely solved a historical mystery. You have given a voice to a woman who was silenced for more than 170 years. You have given her back her name." Among the small crowd of attendees was Pilar Ruiz Morales, now 86, her frail form bundled against the autumn chill, her presence a living link to the crime itself. Her eyes, brimming with tears, were fixed on the monument. "My great-grandmother can finally rest," she whispered to Carmen, her small, wrinkled hand finding Carmen's. Esperanza would be proud to know that her truth, the secret she carried in fear for so long, finally brought justice. The case reverberated far beyond academia, sending shockwaves through historical and genealogical communities worldwide. Inspired by the Mendoza-Carvajal revelations, historians began to re-examine other silenced stories, other convenient narratives of power abused by the elite. Cold cases, long thought unsolvable, were reopened. Carmen declined lucrative offers from universities abroad, choosing instead to remain in New York, the city where the crime had been committed and where justice had finally been served. There, with initial funding from a foundation dedicated to historical justice, she founded a new organization, the Archive Project. It was a small, dedicated team of historians, forensic scientists, and researchers devoted to investigating historical disappearances and unsolved cases where power and privilege may have obstructed the truth. Maria Carmen cannot be the only soul erased by privilege, she told a journalist from National Geographic in an extensive feature. History is full of ghosts. Our job is to listen to them. The daguerreotype had unveiled more than a forbidden romance. It had exposed a system that allowed powerful families to act as judge, jury, and executioner in the defense of their name. A system whose ghosts still haunted the very foundations of the modern world. One quiet spring afternoon, months after the storm had settled into a new, altered reality, Carmen sat alone in her office, the city humming softly outside her window. She was studying the image of Joaquin and Maria Carmen yet again. She had looked at it 1,000 times, but now, in the soft, forgiving light of the late day, her eyes caught something she had somehow, impossibly, missed. There, in the bottom right corner of the copper plate, almost invisible against the dark, shadowy background, was another inscription, so faint and small it was barely a scratch on the silver. It was not part of the main image, but etched directly into the plate itself, a final, secret message from the past. With trembling hands, she brought it to a digital analysis station. Using spectral enhancement, she magnified the tiny marks. The words that slowly emerged on her screen made her eyes sting with hot, sudden tears. Forever. J and MC. Against all odds, in a final, desperate act of defiant love, Joaquin and Maria Carmen had carved their eternity into that fragile silver surface. It was their true marriage certificate, their sacred vow to a future they would never have. The legacy of the story was now complete, and it was a legacy of the most profound, haunting tragedy. The world knew of the family's crime, but only now did Carmen fully grasp the abyssal depth of Joaquin's personal torment. He died believing he had been abandoned, his heart broken not by a cruel fate, but by a cruel, calculated, and intimately personal lie, orchestrated by the very people who should have protected him. His love had been weaponized against him, used as the instrument of his own slow, psychological destruction. His suffering, silent and unseen for so long, was perhaps the most haunting legacy of all. The daguerreotype had fulfilled its mission. After more than 170 years spent in the shadows of a velvet box, it had finally spoken. It had told the world that truth, though it may be buried under the weight of decades, of power, of lies, will always, eventually, find its way to the light. The story of the mysterious couple from 1847 had become a powerful symbol of historical justice, igniting a new generation of researchers to challenge official narratives, to question the histories written by the powerful, and to recover the voices that have been silenced. Carmen's work had set a precedent that even the victims of centuries past deserve remembrance, and that no crime, however ancient, however cold, should remain unpunished. Closing the case file with a deliberate, final care, Carmen understood that she had completed not merely an academic inquiry, but a mission of justice long, long delayed. The mysterious couple of 1847 had at last spoken, and their secret love had permanently altered history's lens. Their story had shown that the power of love could, in the end, pierce the thickest walls of cruelty and convention. And that memory, once reclaimed, could never again be silenced. And so, Joaquin and Maria Carmen, separated in life by the brutal architecture of family and society, were finally granted in death the recognition that had been so violently denied to them. Their love, etched eternally upon a silver-plated copper plate, would endure as a beacon, a quiet but powerful testament. It serves as a solemn reminder for generations yet to come that while power may write the first draft of history, truth waits patiently for its turn to speak. And justice, however delayed, will always, always find its voice